told you that every morning when you wake up and check your phone, you're being remote controlled by dead economists who've been gone for over a century. That the very thoughts you consider your own authentic opinions about success, happiness, relationships, and what makes a person valuable have been carefully programmed into your mind by forces you've never consciously recognized. This isn't science fiction or conspiracy theory. This is the disturbing reality of how human consciousness actually works, and it's been hiding in plain sight for 150 years. Consider this chilling example from recent history. Cambridge Analytica didn't just steal your Facebook data for political manipulation. They weaponized something Karl Marx predicted with terrifying accuracy in the 1800 CSFs. By creating psychographic profiles of working-class voters in Rust Belt states, they convinced people earning minimum wage that tax cuts for billionaires would somehow restore their personal dignity and economic security. The most disturbing part? It actually worked. These voters enthusiastically supported policies that directly harmed their own financial interests because the messaging tapped into a culturally encoded belief that real Americans naturally side with the wealthy against intellectual elites. Marx laid the theoretical foundation for understanding this phenomenon, though the precise term false consciousness was later popularized by his collaborator Friedrich Engels. It describes the process by which we internalize beliefs that serve other people's interests rather than our own, mistaking these manufactured ideas for our authentic thoughts and values. The Cambridge Analytica scandal wasn't just a privacy violation or political dirty trick. It was concrete proof that this psychological control mechanism can override our most basic material self-interest, making us actively vote against our own economic welfare while feeling good about it. This connects directly to groundbreaking research by Dr. John Jost at NYU on what he calls system justification theory. His carefully controlled experiments revealed something that would have made Marx nod with grim satisfaction. People living in demonstrably unfair systems don't just passively tolerate inequality, they actively defend and rationalize it, even when it works directly against their own interests. In one particularly striking study, people from lower economic backgrounds were significantly more likely than wealthy participants to believe that economic inequality was justified, necessary, and even morally good for society. Marx predicted this exact psychological phenomenon over 150 years ago, and today's neuroscience research supports his insights about how our minds can be hegemonically influenced without our conscious awareness. But understanding this mental control system is the first step toward breaking free from it. So let me ask you directly, how many of your daily thoughts, desires, and opinions are actually your own? Karl Marx wrote that the ruling ideas of each age have ever been the ideas of its ruling class. Before you dismiss this as outdated political rhetoric, understand that Marx wasn't making a simple ideological statement. He was describing a sophisticated psychological phenomenon that modern neuroscience has confirmed in disturbing detail. What Marx recognized is that people with economic and political power don't just control resources, institutions, and government policies. They control something far more valuable and influential: the way we think about reality itself. They systematically shape what we consider normal, moral, natural, and possible. But here's what makes this control mechanism truly sophisticated and nearly invisible. This isn't crude propaganda or obvious brainwashing. Instead, it operates through the cultural encoding of ideas so subtle and complete that we mistake these carefully manufactured concepts for our own authentic thoughts and natural human instincts. We don't feel controlled because the control happens at the level of what seems like common sense. Consider this curious fact that most people never question. Why do we collectively accept that some people work 3 full-time jobs and still can't afford basic healthcare or housing, while others inherit billions of dollars without ever working a single day? It's not because this arrangement is natural, inevitable, or the result of some cosmic justice system. We accept it because we've been systematically conditioned to see extreme inequality as normal, even admirable. Modern psychology provides extensive research backing up Marx's insights through studies on what's called cultural cognition. Dr. Dan Kahan's research at Yale Law School demonstrates that people process factual information in ways that conform to the beliefs of their social groups, even when presented with clear, contradictory evidence. Our brains literally filter objective reality to match the dominant narratives of our culture. We're not making independent, rational judgments about the world. We're unconsciously protecting worldviews we've inherited from our social environment. But Marx's psychological insight goes much deeper than just big political ideas or economic policies. He understood that capitalism doesn't merely produce material goods and services. More fundamentally, it produces human relationships, personal identities, and individual desires. As he put it, capital is not only a sum of material products, it is, above all, a sum of social relations. In plain English, the economic system actively shapes who we think we are and what we think we want from life. This insight leads us to fascinating contemporary research that validates Marx's predictions. Dr. Tim Kasser's studies at Knox College demonstrate this psychological manipulation perfectly. His research consistently shows that people who prioritize wealth accumulation and status symbols over relationships and personal growth report significantly higher levels of anxiety, depression, and general life dissatisfaction. But here's the crucial discovery that connects directly to Marx's theory. These materialistic values aren't natural human instincts or genetic predispositions. They're learned responses to a culture that systematically profits from our insecurities and dissatisfaction. Kasser's controlled experiments revealed that even brief exposure to materialistic advertising messages measurably increased people's focus on wealth and status in subsequent psychological tests. This demonstrates that our deepest values and desires can be deliberately shaped through cultural programming. Marx called this process commodity fetishism, the way we gradually start to see human relationships, personal worth, and life satisfaction through the lens of economic exchange. We begin to value ourselves and others primarily based on what we can produce, consume, or accumulate, rather than our inherent human dignity. Look at how we discuss education today as a perfect example of this psychological transformation. Education is rarely framed as being about learning, curiosity, intellectual growth, or becoming a more complete human being. Instead, we consistently frame it as an investment in human capital that should yield a measurable financial return. We've transformed the profound human experience of learning and discovery into a commodity transaction, where knowledge only has value if it increases earning potential. This same pattern of commodification appears everywhere once you start looking for it. Dating apps gamify romance, turning human connection into a marketplace where we literally swipe through potential partners like products in an online catalog. Social media platforms transform friendship into engagement metrics and follower counts. Even our hobbies and creative interests are increasingly expected to become side hustles that generate income, to be considered worthwhile pursuits. Can you think of a single area of your life that hasn't been touched by this economic framing? This is Marx's insight about consciousness playing out in real time across every aspect of human experience. Here's where Marx's psychological sophistication becomes truly remarkable and scientifically prescient. He wrote that it is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. This might sound like abstract philosophical language, but it's actually describing a fundamental truth about human psychology that modern neuroscience research strongly supports. Your social environment doesn't just influence your thoughts and beliefs, it literally rewires the physical structure of your brain at the neural level. A groundbreaking 2023 neuroimaging study had research subjects read statements that directly challenged their existing political beliefs. When conservative participants encountered messages like taxing the wealthy funds innovation, or liberal participants read, Border security protects workers, their amygdala fear centers lit up with activity resembling an actual physical threat, before their logical cortex could even process the information rationally. This is Marx's concept of social being determines consciousness, happening in real time at the level of individual synapses. Ideological programming isn't just abstract ideas floating in our heads. It becomes embedded neural pathways that treat intellectual dissent as a literal survival threat. But the neuroscientific evidence goes even deeper than individual belief formation. Dr. Mauricio Delgado's research at Rutgers University uses advanced brain imaging technology to study how social hierarchies affect neural processing in real time. When research participants believed they occupied a lower position in an artificial social hierarchy created for the experiment, their brains showed measurably decreased activity in regions associated with executive control and critical thinking, alongside increased activity in areas linked to threat detection and stress response. Their neural architecture was being physically reshaped by their perceived social position, making them neurologically more likely to accept authority and less likely to question existing social arrangements. The most disturbing finding was that many participants actively defended the very hierarchical system that was demonstrably harming them psychologically and materially. This connects directly to psychologist Melvin Lerner's influential research on what he termed the just world hypothesis. His carefully controlled experiments showed that people have a deep psychological need to believe that the world operates according to fair principles. When confronted with clear evidence of systemic injustice, instead of questioning the fundamental fairness of existing systems, research subjects consistently engaged in victim blaming or convinced themselves that inequality must somehow be justified. This isn't human stupidity or moral failure. It's our minds performing incredible mental gymnastics to maintain the psychologically comforting illusion that we live in a just world, because accepting that the world is fundamentally unfair threatens our basic sense of security and meaning. This psychological mechanism helps explain why people often become more defensive of unjust systems when presented with evidence of their injustice. Consider how hustle culture operates as a perfect contemporary example of this psychological programming. The pervasive idea that your personal worth is determined by your productivity levels, that rest equals laziness, and that constant work represents virtue has become so culturally embedded that people feel genuine guilt for taking vacations or spending time on non-productive activities. This isn't natural human behavior rooted in our evolutionary psychology. Anthropological evidence, including Marshall Sahlins' influential research on hunter-gatherer societies, suggests that our ancestors typically worked only 3 to 4 hours per day to meet their material needs, spending the rest of their time on social relationships, creative expression, and leisure activities. Yet we've been so thoroughly culturally programmed to see constant work as moral virtue that we've pathologized basic human needs for rest and play. Marx would argue that this psychological conditioning serves the economic interests of those who profit from our labor rather than our own well-being or natural human flourishing. Marx couldn't have predicted the internet, but his theories about consciousness manipulation have found their perfect laboratory in the digital age. Social media platforms represent the most sophisticated form of false consciousness ever created, and they've engineered it to be psychologically addictive. Dr. Shoshana Zuboff's research on surveillance capitalism at Harvard describes how technology companies have evolved beyond simply collecting data about our existing behaviors. They now use that behavioral data to actively influence what we'll think, feel, and do next. Every scroll, click, pause, and eye movement is analyzed by artificial intelligence systems to create psychological profiles more detailed and accurate than we have of ourselves. These platforms then sell access to our attention and psychological vulnerabilities to the highest bidder, who uses sophisticated behavioral psychology techniques to influence our beliefs, desires, and actions in profitable directions. But here's what makes this especially insidious compared to traditional advertising. The algorithm learns to give us content that confirms our existing biases while gradually shifting our views in commercially beneficial directions. A person initially concerned about their physical appearance might start seeing fitness content, which slowly morphs into diet culture messaging, which eventually leads to expensive supplements, procedures, and lifestyle products. Someone interested in financial independence might be algorithmically guided toward cryptocurrency schemes, expensive business courses, or high-risk investment strategies. The progression feels natural and self-directed because it builds on genuine initial interests. Recent whistleblower research by Dr. Guillaume Chasleau, who formerly worked on YouTube's recommendation algorithm, revealed that the platform's artificial intelligence was specifically designed to maximize watch time by gradually leading users toward increasingly extreme content. Moderate political videos systematically led to more partisan content. Casual fitness videos led to extreme diet and exercise regimens. The algorithm had learned through millions of data points that emotional arousal, anger, fear, excitement, outrage, kept people watching longer, so it systematically pushed users toward more extreme versions of whatever they were initially interested in. This represents Marx's concept of false consciousness operating at unprecedented scale and technological sophistication. Millions of people are being simultaneously influenced to believe that their algorithmically shaped desires and beliefs represent their authentic selves and independent thinking. When was the last time you seriously questioned whether your online interests and political opinions actually originated from your own reflection or were subtly shaped by recommendation algorithms designed to maximize corporate profits? Marx made another crucial observation that cuts to the heart of how we understand personal freedom and individual choice. Men make their own history, but they do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. In other words, our sense of personal autonomy is far more constrained and illusory than we typically recognize. Our individual choices happen within social, economic, and cultural frameworks that were established long before we were born, and these inherited frameworks profoundly shape what options we can even perceive as possible. When someone can't afford healthcare, housing, or education, our cultural programming tells us to focus on individual solutions, work harder, make better personal choices, develop more discipline. But what if the real problem isn't individual moral failure, but systemic arrangements that treat basic human needs as luxury commodities available only to those who can afford market prices? Dr. Sendil Molinatan's research on the psychology of scarcity provides scientific backing for Marx's insight about constrained choice. His studies demonstrate that financial stress literally impairs cognitive function, making it significantly harder for people to make optimal decisions even in areas unrelated to money. The chronic stress of economic scarcity creates what he terms psychological tunnel vision, that makes it nearly impossible to think creatively about solutions or long-term planning. Yet our cultural programming consistently frames unemployment, poverty, and economic struggle as individual moral failures rather than predictable outcomes of economic structures that could be organized differently. We've been systematically trained to see joblessness as personal failure, rather than recognizing that employment depends entirely on economic systems created by human choice, not natural law. The same victim-blaming pattern appears across every social issue. We blame individuals for climate change while ignoring that just 100 corporations produce 71% of global carbon emissions. We tell people to vote with their wallets, while ignoring that some wallets contain billions of votes, while others contain none. This isn't accidental misdirection, it's the systematic cultivation of false consciousness that prevents us from questioning fundamental power arrangements. So how do we escape what Marx called the ruling ideas of the ruling class? His answer was surprisingly psychological rather than purely political. We need to become conscious of our own consciousness. This means systematically examining the ideas we take for granted and honestly asking whose interests they actually serve versus whose interests they claim to serve. This connects directly to modern research on metacognition, or thinking about thinking. Studies by Dr. Janet Metcalf at Columbia University show that people with higher metacognitive awareness consistently make better decisions and demonstrate far greater resistance to manipulation and propaganda. Why? Because they can step outside their immediate thoughts and emotional reactions to examine them objectively, like a scientist studying their own mental processes. The most powerful resistance to false consciousness happens when communities create sustained spaces for honest dialogue about their shared reality. Book clubs, discussion groups, community forums, and even informal conversations where people feel safe to question common-sense assumptions become laboratories for authentic thinking. These collaborative spaces allow people to discover that what felt like isolated personal struggles are actually shared symptoms of larger systemic problems. What gives hope is that today's most inspiring social movements are already applying Marx's insights about consciousness transformation, often without explicitly naming them as such. The movement for universal basic income challenges the deeply embedded cultural belief that human worth depends on productive output. Environmental justice campaigns force us to confront the manufactured illusion that endless economic growth is natural or necessary for human well-being. Mental health advocacy reframes depression and anxiety not as individual character defects, but as rational responses to fundamentally unhealthy social systems. Each of these movements begins with the same powerful realization that Marx identified. What we often call human nature is really just current culture, and culture can be deliberately changed through collective conscious effort. Once we recognize that our thoughts, desires, and beliefs have been shaped by forces beyond our awareness, we can begin the process of reshaping them in directions that actually serve human flourishing rather than corporate profits. This isn't abstract theory disconnected from daily life. You've now seen how internalized voices, unquestioned assumptions, and invisible ideologies shape how you think, feel, and live. But once these mechanisms are exposed and understood, they begin to lose their unconscious grip on your mind. Once questioned and examined, they can be consciously rewritten. So here's your invitation to quiet rebellion. Start noticing and questioning the voices in your head. When guilt creeps in for resting, ask whose voice is telling you that productivity equals human worth. When you feel inadequate scrolling through social media, question whose standards are defining success and happiness. When something feels obviously true and natural, pause and wonder, says who? And who benefits from me believing this? Most importantly, don't undertake this consciousness work alone. Marx understood that authentic liberation happens collectively, through sustained dialogue and shared reflection. Find friends, groups, or communities where you can safely explore these questions together. Which beliefs do we want to consciously choose to keep, which were planted in us primarily for someone else's economic benefit? What's one obvious truth about success, human nature, or how the world works that you've never seriously questioned? And this is how genuine resistance begins, not with slogans or rage, but with clarity and conscious reflection. Not by attempting to tear down existing systems overnight, but by seeing through the psychological illusions that make those systems seem natural and inevitable. Once we collectively recognize the strings controlling our thoughts, we can begin cutting them. Once we question what seems obvious, we can choose what's actually worth believing and defending. Tonight, when you're scrolling through your phone or consuming media, pause and ask yourself, is this desire, opinion, or emotion actually mine, or is it an algorithm's profit plan? That simple question alone represents a quiet but powerful act of rebellion against the forces that would control your consciousness without your knowledge or consent.